Imagine being the greatest fighter pilot your country has ever produced. Imagine surviving 4 brutal years of combat in the Pacific, shooting down 40 enemy aircraft, shaking the hand of General Douglas MacArthur himself, receiving the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States, and then coming home a hero, only to die alone in a field in California, not from a Japanese bullet, not from a flak burst over the jungles of New Guinea, but from a malfunctioning fuel pump in a brand new jet aircraft you were testing on a perfectly clear summer morning. That is the story of Major Richard Bong. And if you have never heard that name, that is exactly the problem this video is going to fix. There is something about the stories we forget that hurts more than the stories we remember. We build monuments to the battles. We name streets after generals. We make movies about the famous campaigns. But sometimes the most extraordinary human beings slip through the cracks of public memory, and they vanish into the footnotes of history books that nobody reads anymore. Richard Bong was not a footnote. He was the headline. He was the standard by which every American fighter pilot was measured. He was the young man from Poplar, Wisconsin, who climbed into a cockpit and became something that no American before him or since has ever become. He became the undisputed, officially recognized, all-time leading ace in the entire history of United States military aviation. 40 confirmed aerial kills. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed in combat. A number that still stands today, more than 80 years later, untouched, unbroken, unreachable. And yet most people today could not tell you his name. So we are going to change that right now. We are going to spend the next 2 hours going on a journey together. We are going to travel back to a small dairy farming community in northern Wisconsin in the 1920s, and we are going to watch a skinny kid grow up staring at the sky. We are going to follow him through flight school, through the chaos of the early Pacific War, through the blood and fire of New Guinea and the Philippines, through his friendship with the legendary Tommy McGuire, through his romance with a young woman named Marge whose photograph he painted on the nose of his P-38. And finally, we are going to stand with him on that terrible morning of August 6, 1945, in Burbank, California, and we are going to understand exactly what happened and why it still matters. This is not just a story about a pilot. This is a story about what it means to be born to do one thing, to do that one thing better than anyone who has ever lived, and then to have it all taken away in a moment that makes no sense whatsoever. This is a story about war and peace, about glory and grief, about the terrible randomness of fate. And it begins, as all great American stories begin, in a place so small and so quiet that you have probably never heard of it. Poplar, Wisconsin. Population just over 1,000 people. Situated in Douglas County in the far northwestern corner of the state, close enough to Lake Superior that on a clear day you could smell the water in the air. It was farming country, hard country, the kind of place where families got up before dawn and worked until after dark and did not complain about it, because complaining did not get the cows milked or the fields planted. The Bong family fit right into that landscape. Carl Bong, Richard's father, was a Swedish immigrant who had come to America with nothing and built a life through sheer stubbornness and physical labor. He and his wife Dora raised 9 children on their farm, and Richard Bong, born on September 24, 1920, was the oldest. From the very beginning, people who knew young Richard remembered him as quiet. Not shy, exactly, but self-contained. He was the kind of boy who observed the world carefully before deciding to participate in it. He was respectful to adults, patient with his younger siblings, reliable in his farm chores, and almost entirely uninterested in any kind of trouble or mischief. His teachers at school remembered him as a good student, not a spectacular one, but steady and dependable. He played sports with his friends. He went to church with his family. He did everything a small-town Wisconsin boy in the 1930s was supposed to do. But there was one thing that set Richard Bong apart from every other boy in Poplar, and that was the way he looked at airplanes. Whenever a plane flew over Douglas County, which was not often in those years, Richard Bong stopped whatever he was doing and watched it until it disappeared from sight. He read every magazine article about aviation he could find. He built model aircraft from balsa wood and paper. He saved every penny he could get his hands on. And when he was 16 years old, he spent those pennies on his first flight lesson at a small airstrip near Superior, Wisconsin. The moment the wheels left the ground, something happened to Richard Bong that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite managing to put into adequate words. He simply belonged up there. He knew it the way you know when you have found the thing you were made for, with a certainty that does not require any argument or justification. The sky was his natural environment, and everything else, the farm, the school, the small-town routines, was just the waiting room. He enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, not because he had any particular passion for education, but because it gave him access to the civilian pilot training program, which the United States government had established in 1939 as the clouds of war gathered over Europe and Asia. The government was not being altruistic. They knew that if America was pulled into the coming conflict, they were going to need trained pilots by the thousands, and they wanted those pilots to already have their basic licenses before the shooting started. For Richard Bong, the program was a gift from heaven. He threw himself into it with an intensity that surprised even his instructors. He had a natural feel for an aircraft that veterans of 20 years of flying rarely developed. His hands on the controls were instinctive, precise, and absolutely calm. Even in his earliest training flights, when other student pilots were white-knuckling through maneuvers and fighting their nerves, Bong was relaxed, observant, and already thinking 3 moves ahead. He completed the civilian pilot training program and immediately applied to the United States Army Air Corps. This was September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, and the Army was still in the early stages of its massive expansion. Bong was accepted and sent to primary flight training, then basic training, then advanced training at Luke Field in Arizona, where he learned to fly military aircraft with the discipline and precision that combat would require. His instructors consistently rated him as one of the most naturally gifted pilots they had ever trained. There was a quality to his flying that went beyond technical skill. He seemed to have an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional space, of angles and distances and velocities that other pilots had to laboriously calculate, while Bong simply felt. Then came December 7th, 1941, and the world changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a military catastrophe. It was a psychological earthquake that shook America to its foundations. In the space of a single Sunday morning, the United States went from a nation that was still debating whether to enter the war to a nation with no choice left to debate. The Army Air Corps, which became the Army Air Forces in the reorganization that followed, suddenly found itself in desperate need of combat pilots. The training pipelines accelerated. The standards were maintained, because you could not afford to send undertrained pilots against the Japanese and expect anything but a massacre. But the pace became urgent in a way it had never been before. Richard Bong received his wings and his commission as a second lieutenant in January of 1942. He was 21 years old. Before he shipped out to the Pacific, he got into trouble. The kind of trouble that would have ended the career of almost any other pilot, but that in Bong's case somehow only added to his legend. He was stationed in California, and one afternoon he decided to fly his P-38 Lightning down Market Street in San Francisco at low altitude. Not just low altitude, rooftop level. He then, according to accounts that became more colorful with each retelling, looped around the Golden Gate Bridge and performed aerobatics over residential neighborhoods. Housewives reportedly had their laundry blown off their clotheslines by his prop wash. General George Kenney, who would become Bong's commanding officer in the Pacific and one of his greatest champions, received a furious complaint from the commander of the Western Defense Command and was ordered to do something about this reckless young pilot. Kenney called Bong into his office, fully prepared to deliver a severe reprimand. What happened instead was that Kenney, a man who had spent 30 years around aviators and knew extraordinary talent when he saw it, took one look at Richard Bong, listened to his calm and completely unapologetic explanation of what he had done, and made a decision. He told Bong that the stunts were dangerous, irresponsible, and not to be repeated. Then, reportedly, he sent him off with a warning so mild that it barely qualified as a slap on the wrist. Kenney later wrote in his memoirs that he had recognized immediately that Bong was going to be something special, and he was not going to ground the best natural pilot he had ever encountered over a few loops around a bridge. In the summer of 1942, Second Lieutenant Richard Bong was assigned to the 49th Fighter Group in Australia, part of the 5th Air Force under General Kenny's command. He flew his first combat missions in September of that year over New Guinea, the massive, jungle-covered island north of Australia that had become one of the most brutal and disease-ridden theaters of the entire war. New Guinea was not a place that showed up in the Hollywood movies about the Pacific War. It did not have the dramatic naval battles of Midway or the iconic island assaults of Iwo Jima. What it had was endless miles of impenetrable jungle, mountains that reached above 15,000 feet, coastal swamps that bred malaria by the millions, heat that made men wilt before noon, and Japanese forces that were fighting with a ferocity and determination that the Americans had not fully anticipated. And it had the sky. And the sky, as Richard Bong was about to prove, was his. His aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and understanding that airplane is essential to understanding Richard Bong. The P-38 was unusual in an era when most fighter aircraft followed the conventional single-engine, single-fuselage design. The Lightning had twin engines, twin-tail booms, and a central nacelle that housed the cockpit and the armament. It was big for a fighter, heavier than its opponents, and in some respects less maneuverable at low speeds than the Japanese Zero. But it had advantages that, in the hands of the right pilot, made it devastating. It was extraordinarily fast, capable of more than 400 miles per hour in level flight. It had tremendous range, which in the vast Pacific theater was not a luxury, but a necessity. It climbed powerfully, and it hit with tremendous force, because its 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon were all mounted in the nose and converged at a single point, rather than being spread across the wings, which meant that at the right distance, every single round in the burst hit the target simultaneously. Most importantly, the P-38 gave a pilot like Bong a platform from which his instincts could operate. He developed a style of combat that was elegantly simple and brutally effective. He did not believe in prolonged dogfighting, in trying to outturn the Zero at low speeds, which was a game no American pilot could win. Instead, he used his altitude, his speed, and his absolute precision in deflection shooting to destroy his targets in single, decisive passes. He would dive from high altitude with tremendous energy, close to within a few hundred yards of his target, fire a short, accurate burst, and then use his speed to climb away before the enemy could react. It sounds simple. In the history of aerial warfare, very few pilots have ever been able to execute it with the consistency and accuracy that Bong demonstrated day after day, mission after mission. His first aerial victory came on December 27, 1942, when he shot down a Japanese aircraft over New Guinea. He was so calm about it afterward that his squadron mates were slightly unnerved. Most pilots, after their first kill, were shaking with adrenaline, talking too fast, reliving every moment of the engagement with barely controlled excitement. Bong described what had happened with the measured precision of a man reporting a routine training flight. Yes, he had engaged the enemy aircraft. Yes, he had fired. Yes, it had gone down. He was fairly certain it had crashed. Did anyone want some coffee? Over the next several months, the kills accumulated. 3, 5, 8, 10. Each one documented. Each one confirmed by witnesses or gun camera film were available. By the spring of 1943, Bong was the leading American ace in the Pacific, and the number was still climbing. General Kenny, who had taken a personal interest in his career from the beginning, was both delighted and genuinely concerned. Delighted because Bong was becoming a propaganda asset of enormous value at a time when America desperately needed heroes. Concerned because every mission was another opportunity for the one engagement that even the best pilot could not survive. Kenny began to manage Bong's career carefully, sometimes assigning him to missions himself to ensure he was in the right place at the right time, sometimes pulling him back when the odds seemed too unfavorable. It was during this period that Bong formed one of the most famous and complicated rivalries in the history of American military aviation. Major Thomas Buchanan McGuire Jr., known to everyone as Tommy, was a fighter pilot of extraordinary ability who was serving in the Pacific and who had made it his personal mission to break Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 aerial victories from the First World War. McGuire was everything that Bong was not in terms of personality. He was loud, competitive, openly ambitious, and completely transparent about wanting to be the best. He had the flying skill to back it up. By late 1943, McGuire was closing in on the record, and so was Bong, and the two men were aware of each other in the way that two great athletes in the same sport are always aware of each other. The relationship between them was never simple. They flew in different units, which meant they did not spend their daily lives together, but they moved in the same circles, attended some of the same briefings, and were inevitably compared in every conversation about Pacific air power. People who knew them both said there was genuine mutual respect underneath the rivalry, that they recognized in each other a quality of flying ability that went beyond anything they encountered in other pilots. But there was also real competitive tension, because both men understood that history remembers the winner, and in the business of aerial victories, the winner is defined by a number. Bong reached 26 kills, tying Rickenbacker's record, in early 1944. He was 23 years old. The Army Air Force's press machine went into overdrive. Here was the story they had been waiting for: the quiet farm boy from Wisconsin, the gentle giant of the fighter pilot world, the man who flew without apparent fear and killed without apparent hatred, and went home afterward to write letters to a girl named Marge back in Poplar. General MacArthur himself presented Bong with the Medal of Honor in December of 1944, standing on an airstrip in the Philippines, telling him in his grand theatrical manner that there was no combat unit in the world that could match the record of this extraordinary young American. But we need to go back, because before that ceremony, before the Medal of Honor, there was the romance that became as much a part of the Dick Bong legend as the aerial victories. Marge Vattendahl, called Marge by everyone who knew her, was a young woman from Superior, Wisconsin, not far from Bong's hometown of Poplar. They had met at a dance before the war, and the connection between them had been immediate and genuine. Bong was not a man who expressed himself easily in person. He was quiet in social situations, more comfortable listening than talking, and in the company of strangers he could seem almost impossibly reserved. But with Marge, something opened up. He wrote her letters from the Pacific that were tender and honest in a way that surprised people who thought they knew him. When he was given his first leave back to the United States in late 1943, he went straight to Superior, Wisconsin, and he asked Marge Vattendahl to marry him. She said yes. He painted her name and her likeness on the nose of his P-38, in the tradition that Pacific War pilots had inherited from their World War I predecessors. The nose art became famous in its own right, reproduced in newspapers and magazines across America. The image of the gentle farm boy who carried his sweetheart's face into battle against the Japanese. It was precisely the kind of story that a war-weary nation in 1943 needed desperately, and the Army Air Force's publicity apparatus did everything it could to ensure that everyone in America knew it. What the publicity apparatus did not always emphasize was the reality of what Bong was doing every time he climbed into that cockpit with Marge's face painted on the nose. The Pacific Air War was not a clean or romantic enterprise. The skies over New Guinea and Leyte and Lingayen Gulf and a dozen other places whose names most Americans could not find on a map were filled with smoke and flame and the terrible sound of engines screaming beyond their limits. Men died in their cockpits, burned alive when fuel tanks ignited. Men bailed out over jungle that was so thick and so hostile that rescue was more theoretical than practical. Men simply disappeared, their aircraft vanishing into clouds or ocean without a trace, and their families waited for telegrams that never came because there was nothing to report except absence. Bong survived all of it. Not through recklessness, not through luck alone, not through some supernatural protection, but through a combination of extraordinary skill, sound tactical judgment, and the kind of situational awareness in the air that cannot be taught and cannot be learned, but is simply there in some pilots from the very first time they leave the ground. He was shot at hundreds of times. He was hit on at least several occasions, returning to base with damage to his aircraft that required repair. But he was never wounded. He was never even close to being captured. He flew into combat against some of the finest fighter pilots Japan had produced, men who had been flying since the late 1930s, who had combat experience dating back to the China campaigns, who flew with their own extraordinary skill and their own fierce determination. And he beat them. Every time. 40 times. 27. 28. By the autumn of 1944, the number was in the 30s, and the Army Air Forces was beginning to have an increasingly serious problem. Their greatest propaganda asset was also their greatest combat risk. Richard Bong could not be replaced if he was killed, not in terms of his value as a pilot, and not in terms of his value as a symbol. Kenny continued his careful management of Bong's assignments, but he could not ground him outright. Bong would not have accepted it gracefully, and the press would have noticed. So the general allowed the missions to continue while working behind the scenes to bring Bong home before the number reached 40 and something terrible happened. In October of 1944, Bong shot down his 38th enemy aircraft, then his 39th. He was given leave to return to the United States, ostensibly to marry Marge, which he did on February 10, 1945, in a ceremony in Superior, Wisconsin, that was covered by newspapers across the country. He was 24 years old. He had 40 kills. He held the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 7 oak leaf clusters, and the Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters. He had been promoted to major. He had met President Roosevelt. He had stood beside MacArthur. He was the most decorated combat pilot in American history. And now, in the spring of 1945, he was a newlywed, a national hero, and a man with no particular idea of what to do with himself in peacetime. The Army Air Forces, sensitive to the propaganda damage of losing their greatest ace in combat now that victory was beginning to seem inevitable, had officially removed Bong from combat status. He would not fly in the Pacific again. The war in Europe was winding toward its close. The war in the Pacific was moving toward its final terrible confrontation, with the planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, already underway. But Richard Bong would not be part of it. He would come home. He would be a husband. He would be a hero in peacetime. He would use his fame to sell war bonds and inspire recruitment and do all the things that the Army needed famous young heroes to do. But Richard Bong was not built for that life. The parades were fine. The handshakes were fine. The speeches, which he delivered in his quiet, slightly awkward way, were fine. He was never comfortable as a public figure, never at ease with the celebrity that had been thrust upon him. And in the months after his return to the United States, people who were close to him noticed a restlessness that he did not quite know how to explain. He had been flying combat missions for more than 2 years. He had lived at a level of intensity and purpose that ordinary peacetime existence simply could not replicate. The farm in Poplar was still there. Marge was there. The people who loved him were there. And he was grateful for all of it. But the sky was there too, and the sky was pulling at him with a force that nothing on the ground could quite counteract. The solution that the Army and Lockheed Aircraft Corporation arrived at seemed, at the time, to be ideal. Bong was assigned as a test pilot at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. He would work with the company's engineering team to evaluate new aircraft, pushing them to their limits, identifying problems, and refining performance characteristics. It was flying. It was demanding, technically sophisticated flying that required precisely the kind of calm precision and three-dimensional spatial awareness that Bong possessed in abundance. It was not combat, but it was the closest thing available. And it was something genuinely important, because the aircraft Bong would be testing was not just another propeller-driven fighter. It was the future. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was America's first operational jet fighter. Jet propulsion was not new as a concept in 1945. The British had been flying jet aircraft since 1941, and the Germans had introduced the Messerschmitt 262 in combat. But for most American pilots, the jet engine was still exotic and slightly mysterious. It did not behave like a piston engine. The thrust characteristics were different. The acceleration was different. The way the aircraft responded to control inputs at extreme speeds was different. The P-80 was fast, very fast, with a top speed of more than 500 miles per hour that made even the best propeller aircraft of the war look pedestrian. But it also had handling characteristics that were unfamiliar, and like all early jets, it had mechanical reliability issues that needed to be identified and resolved before the aircraft could be trusted in combat. That was what Richard Bong was there to do, and he was good at it. He had a natural ability to describe in precise, useful terms exactly what an aircraft was doing and why, which is a skill that not all great combat pilots possess. Combat flying requires instinct and reflexes. Test flying requires instinct and reflexes plus the ability to analyze and articulate what those instincts are telling you, to translate sensation into data that engineers can use. Bong could do both. The work suited him, and the P-80 fascinated him. He was excited about jets in a way that he had not been excited about anything since the early days of combat, when everything was new and the sky was full of possibilities. He wrote letters to Marge from Burbank that were more animated than his letters had been in months. He was flying again, really flying, and the weight that had settled on him in the strange limbo of post-combat celebrity was lifting. The P-80 was a real airplane. It demanded his complete attention and his best skills. It reminded him of what he was. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Major Richard Bong climbed into a P-80 Shooting Star at Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank, California, for a test flight. It was a clear summer morning. The San Fernando Valley was already warming in the California sun. He had flown the P-80 multiple times before. He was comfortable with it. He taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and began his takeoff roll. And then something went wrong. The P-80 used an Allison J-33 jet engine. Early jet engines of this type were notoriously finicky about their fuel systems, and the J-33 had a specific vulnerability related to its fuel boost pump. If the boost pump failed at a critical moment during takeoff, when the engine was demanding maximum fuel flow and the aircraft was committed to the takeoff roll but had not yet reached sufficient speed to be safely airborne, the result could be catastrophic. The engine would lose power at the worst possible moment, at low altitude, at low speed, with the aircraft just barely off the ground and with no margin for error. Exactly what happened inside the fuel system of Richard Bong's P-80 on the morning of August 6th has been analyzed and debated by aviation historians for 8 decades. The most widely accepted conclusion is that the electric fuel boost pump, which was supposed to ensure adequate fuel pressure during takeoff, failed. The engine lost power. Bong was at an altitude of only a few hundred feet, moving at a speed that did not give him enough energy to do anything useful. He attempted to bail out. The ejection seat technology that later generations of fighter pilots would rely on did not yet exist in the P-80 of 1945. Bailing out meant physically getting out of the cockpit, which at low altitude and low speed was extraordinarily difficult. He did not make it. The aircraft crashed in a field near the airstrip. Major Richard Bong, America's all-time leading ace, the most decorated fighter pilot in the history of American military aviation, the young man from Poplar, Wisconsin, who had shot down 40 Japanese aircraft and survived every one of those encounters, was dead. He was 24 years old. He had been married for 5 months. His wife Marge was pregnant with their first child. The date was August 6, 1945. In a coincidence of timing so terrible that it seems almost impossible, on that same day, on the other side of the world, the Enola Gay, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress of the 509th Composite Group, dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb that would, in combination with the bomb dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later, bring the war in the Pacific to its sudden and devastating end. The two events that happened on the same August day are connected by nothing except the calendar. But together they mark the end of an era in aviation history, the moment when the age of the propeller ace, the age of individual combat skill in the sky, was giving way to the age of atomic weapons and jet aircraft in conflicts in which no single pilot's excellence would ever again be the defining factor. Richard Bong's death was announced to the American public on August 8th. The news hit with a force that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not been following his story for the previous 2 years. He had survived everything the war could throw at him. He had come home. He had gotten married. He was supposed to be safe now. The war was nearly over. And he was dead in a field in California, testing an airplane, on a perfect summer morning. The reaction was grief of a particular and complex kind. People did not just mourn Richard Bong. They mourned what his death meant. They mourned the revelation that even the safest seeming outcome, the hero who had made it home, was not actually safe. They mourned the proof that fate had no respect for narrative, no concern for the story structure that should have carried America's greatest ace through to a long and comfortable and celebrated peacetime life. They mourned the terrible irony of a man who had cheated death 40 times in combat being taken by a mechanical failure on a California airstrip. General Guinea, who had watched over Bong's career with something approaching a father's pride and a father's fear, was devastated. He later wrote that losing Bong was one of the hardest things the war had required him to bear, and he included in that assessment not just the official loss of an extraordinary pilot, but the personal loss of a young man he had genuinely loved. MacArthur's headquarters issued a statement of tribute that ran in newspapers across the Pacific Theater. President Truman ordered that Bong be given a state funeral appropriate to his status as the nation's greatest military aviator. He was buried in Poplar, Wisconsin, in the town where he had grown up, in the ground that had grown the boy who had looked up at passing aircraft and known, with a certainty that needed no argument, that the sky was where he belonged. Marge Bong, his wife of 5 months, gave birth to their son later that year. She would remarry eventually, as life requires, but she never forgot Dick, and she spent years afterward working to ensure that his memory was preserved and his story was told. There is a museum in Superior, Wisconsin, the Richard I Bong Veterans Historical Center, that houses a restored P-38 Lightning and tells the story of his life and service with the care and thoroughness it deserves. There is a bridge in Superior named for him. There are streets and schools and parks. Wisconsin has not forgotten its greatest son, even if much of the rest of the country has. But we need to talk about that record, because 40 kills is not just a number. It is a statement about the nature of aerial combat and the specific kind of genius that Bong possessed. Let us put it in context. Eddie Rickenbacker, who was the American ace of aces from the First World War and whose record Bong broke, had 26 kills. The second highest American ace of World War II was Tommy McGuire, who died in combat in January of 1945 with 38 kills, 2 fewer than Bong. The third highest American ace of the war had 34 kills. The gap between Bong and the rest of the American field is extraordinary. The gap between Bong's record and any American pilot in any subsequent conflict is even more extraordinary, because no American pilot in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, or any other subsequent conflict has come close. The reasons for this are multiple and worth understanding. The nature of aerial warfare changed dramatically after World War II. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, radar systems, and the sheer complexity of modern air warfare made the kind of individual close-quarters dogfighting that produced high kill counts far less common. Modern air-to-air combat is fought at greater distances, with sophisticated weapons systems, and the pilot's role has become more that of a system operator and less that of a pure stick-and-rudder combatant. The circumstances that produced Richard Bong's 40 kills, for years of constant combat against large numbers of enemy aircraft in a theater where American pilots with superior training and equipment met Japanese opponents in conditions that frequently favored aggressive tactical flying, were specific to their historical moment and have not been replicated. This is not to diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. 40 kills required not just skill, but opportunity. And not just opportunity, but the ability to convert opportunity into result with a consistency that bordered on the supernatural. Pilots who saw Bong in combat described him in terms that sound almost mythological in retrospect. He seemed to know where the Japanese were going before they knew themselves. He could calculate deflection shots, the adjustment for a moving target, with an intuitive precision that other pilots could only approximate. He was never flustered, never rushed, never panicked. In the most intense and dangerous situations imaginable, Richard Bong was calm. There is a psychological literature on what makes elite combat pilots different from other pilots, and it consistently identifies a small cluster of characteristics that appear in the greatest aces of every nation in every era. Spatial awareness is the first and most important, the ability to maintain an accurate three-dimensional picture of the combat environment even as it changes rapidly and chaotically. Emotional regulation is the second, the ability to suppress the fear response that would otherwise interfere with fine motor control and clear thinking. Pattern recognition is the third, the ability to read an evolving tactical situation and predict its development faster than an opponent can respond. Bong had all three in quantities that his contemporaries recognized as exceptional even by the standards of the elite community of fighter pilots. General George Kenney, who in addition to being Bong's commanding officer was one of the most sophisticated tactical thinkers in the Army Air Forces, said flatly that Bong was the finest combat pilot he had ever encountered and that he doubted anyone would ever match the combination of natural ability, competitive drive, and tactical intelligence that made him what he was. Coming from Kenney, who had seen thousands of pilots in 30 years of aviation, that was not a casual compliment. Tommy McGuire, who had more reason than anyone to find some flaw in Bong's greatness, acknowledged it without reservation. The two men were competitors, and the competition between them was real and sometimes painful, but McGuire was honest enough to recognize that what Bong did in the air was in a category of its own. When reporters asked McGuire about Bong in late 1944, as Bong was pushing toward 40 kills and McGuire was working toward his own record, McGuire gave answers that were respectful and straightforward and utterly without the false modesty that a lesser man might have deployed. Bong was the best. McGuire was second. McGuire was working to change that equation. But he was not pretending the equation was wrong. McGuire never got the chance. On January 7, 1945, while attempting to help a squadron mate who was being attacked by a Japanese fighter over the Philippines, McGuire violated the tactical principle that had kept him alive for so long. He attempted a tight, low-speed maneuver in a P-38 that was still carrying its external fuel tanks, which dramatically compromised the aircraft's handling. The P-38 stalled. At low altitude, there was no recovery. McGuire was killed instantly. He was 24 years old, and he had 38 kills. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The deaths of both Bong and McGuire within 7 months of each other, one in combat in January and one in a test flight accident in August, gave the story of their rivalry a tragic symmetry that has fascinated historians ever since. They were the two greatest American fighter pilots of the war. They were both 24 years old when they died. They both died in P-38s or P-38 era aircraft. They both received the Medal of Honor. The parallels are so precise that they seem almost designed, except that life does not design its symmetries with any benevolent intent. It just produces them sometimes, randomly, and leaves it to the rest of us to decide what they mean. What does the story of Richard Bong mean? It is a question worth sitting with for a moment, because the easy answers are not quite satisfying. The easy answer is that he was a great hero who died too young, and we should honor his memory. That is true, but it does not quite capture what is most interesting and most disturbing about his story. The more honest answer requires looking at the full picture, including the parts that are uncomfortable. Richard Bong was a weapon, not in a dehumanizing sense, but in a precise and literal one. He was a human instrument of extraordinary lethality, refined and deployed by the United States Army Air Forces to destroy enemy aircraft and the men inside them. He was extraordinarily good at his job. He killed 40 people. Each of those 40 kill marks on the side of his P-38 represented a man who had boarded his aircraft that morning with some intention of surviving the day and had not survived it. We do not know their names. We do not know their stories. The historical record of the Pacific Air War does not generally preserve the individual identities of the Japanese pilots who fell to American guns, and there is an asymmetry in this that is worth acknowledging. Bong's story is preserved in extraordinary detail. The stories of the men he killed are almost entirely lost. This is not a reason to diminish what Bong accomplished or to view him as anything other than the extraordinary soldier he was, fighting in a war that America had not started and could not avoid. But it is a reason to hold the full complexity of the story in view, to understand that what made him a hero in the context of 1942 through 1945 was specifically and exclusively his ability to kill the enemy more efficiently than anyone else, and that this is not a simple or comfortable thing to celebrate, even when the cause was just and the enemy was real. There is also the question of what the Army Air Forces was doing with Richard Bong in the last months of his life, and whether they bear some responsibility for his death. The argument can be made, and has been made, that assigning America's greatest ace to test an early jet aircraft, an aircraft with known reliability issues in a class of propulsion technology that was entirely new, was an unnecessary risk. Bong was not the only qualified pilot available to test the P-80. He was not irreplaceable in that role in the way that he had been irreplaceable as a combat pilot. The decision to use him as a test pilot, made with the best of intentions and with genuine concern for keeping him out of further combat, nevertheless placed him in a situation where a mechanical failure could and did kill him. The fuel boost pump issue in the P-80 was a known problem. It had caused accidents before Bong's and would cause more afterward. The P-80 went through significant modifications to its fuel system before it was fully trusted for operational use. In a different world, with different decisions made in the spring and summer of 1945, Richard Bong might not have been in that cockpit on August 6th. He might have lived. He might have gone home to Marge and the baby that was coming. He might have had a long career in the post-war Air Force, or gone back to Wisconsin, or done any of 1,000 other things that the random trajectories of ordinary human lives lead people to do. But that world did not happen. And perhaps the most important thing about the story of Richard Bong is precisely this: that the world we get is not the world we planned for. That the greatest achievements of a human life do not protect that life from the blind indifference of mechanical failure and bad luck. That the story does not always end the way it should. That heroes die in fields on clear summer mornings while their pregnant wives wait for them to come home. The Japanese forces against whom Bong had flown his 40 missions surrendered on August 15, 1945, 9 days after his death and 9 days after Hiroshima. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the moment that officially ended the Second World War. Richard Bong did not live to see it. He died 9 days before the war he had given 4 years of his life to fighting was finally over. 9 days. If he had not been assigned to test the P-80, he might well have been at a base somewhere in the Pacific, listening to the radio announcement of Japan's surrender, celebrating with his fellow pilots, writing a letter to Marge about what it felt like to know that it was really, finally over. 9 days. The post-war period brought enormous changes to American military aviation that Bong would have witnessed with fascination. The jet age that he had been helping to develop arrived with stunning speed. Within 5 years of the war's end, jet aircraft were fighting in Korea. Within 15 years, they were breaking the sound barrier routinely. Within 20 years, missiles had largely replaced guns as the primary air-to-air weapons, making the kind of close-range deflection shooting that Bong had mastered effectively obsolete. Within 30 years, the pilots were wearing G-suits and helmets with heads-up displays that would have seemed like science fiction in 1945. The P-38 that he had flown so brilliantly became a museum piece, its twin booms and distinctive silhouette preserved in a handful of airworthy examples that appear at air shows to crowds who know they are seeing something from another world. The world of aerial combat that produced Richard Bong's 40 kills is gone. It is as remote from the present day as the cavalry charges of the Civil War. The men who flew and fought in it are almost all gone now. The youngest combat pilots of World War II would be in their late 90s today. The specific combination of technology, tactics, industrial scale, and individual human excellence that made the Pacific Air War what it was will never exist again. What it produced, in terms of human achievement, was Richard Bong. And what Richard Bong represented, in terms of what a single human being could accomplish through natural gifts combined with technical training and absolute fearlessness, was something that the subsequent history of aviation has confirmed as unrepeatable. 40 kills. No American before, no American since. The record stands because the era that made it possible is gone. Bong's 40 kills are as permanent a part of the historical record as Babe Ruth's 60 home runs or Jesse Owens's 4 gold medals, achievements that were made possible by a specific historical moment and that the passage of time has elevated from impressive to mythological. And yet, unlike Ruth and Owens, Bong is largely forgotten by the general public. Ask any random sample of Americans to name the most decorated fighter pilot in American history, and the percentage who can answer correctly is vanishingly small. This is partly because his story is specific to a particular kind of military history that is not taught comprehensively in schools. It is partly because the Pacific Theater, despite being the larger and in many ways more complex of the two main theaters of World War II, has always lived in the cultural shadow of the European theater. It is partly because the nature of aerial combat does not produce the kind of graspable visual narrative that ground combat does. It is partly because Bong himself was not a self-promoter. He did not write a memoir. He did not give speeches about his own greatness. He was not Eddie Rickenbacker, who survived the First World War, went on to become a celebrated businessman, wrote extensively about his experiences, and maintained his public profile for decades. Bong was 24 when he died. He had barely started. There is also something else, something harder to articulate. Richard Bong makes people uncomfortable in a way that other World War II heroes do not, because his greatness was so specifically the greatness of killing. The most celebrated heroes of the American memory of World War II tend to be men whose heroism expressed itself in acts of self-sacrifice, in protecting others, in leadership, in resilience under impossible conditions. Bong's heroism expressed itself in the precise and efficient destruction of enemy aircraft and the men inside them. He was not a protector. He was a destroyer. And while the destruction he wrought was entirely justified by the circumstances of a war that America had not chosen and could not lose, there is something in the American national mythology that has always been slightly uneasy with celebrating pure lethality, even when the lethality is directed at an enemy that fully deserved to be destroyed. This discomfort, this slight cultural unease with the meaning of what Bong actually did, is not a reason to look away from his story. It is, if anything, a reason to look at it more carefully. Because understanding what it took to do what Bong did, what it cost him, what it cost the men he killed, and what it ultimately could not protect him from, is to understand something important and true about the nature of war that the comfortable, simplified version of World War II mythology tends to gloss over. The Wisconsin community that produced Richard Bong has never forgotten him. Superior and Poplar maintain his memory with a fierce local pride that is both moving and entirely appropriate. The Richard I Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior is one of the finest small military museums in the United States. It houses a Lockheed P-38L Lightning, fully restored to flying condition at enormous expense and effort, that serves as the centerpiece of an exhibit that tells Bong's story from his childhood to his death with the care and detail it deserves. The museum is staffed largely by veterans and dedicated volunteers who understand that they are the last generation with living memory of what World War II was, and who have committed themselves to ensuring that the next generation inherits not just the facts but the human meaning of the conflict. The P-38 in the museum is not the specific aircraft that Bong flew, since the original Marge was not preserved and surviving P-38s are extraordinarily rare, but it is the same type, the same model, the same distinctive twin-boom configuration that Bong used to destroy 40 Japanese aircraft in the skies over New Guinea and the Philippines. Standing beside it, looking up at its size and its power and its age, it is possible to feel something of what it must have been like to climb into one of these machines in 1943 and point it toward the enemy. Possible, but not fully possible, because the full reality of what Bong experienced in those cockpits, the noise, the G-forces, the fear that he never quite admitted to, the absolute focus required to do what he did, is beyond reconstruction. It happened. It was real. And then it was over. What we are left with is the record and the story. 40 kills. The greatest in American history. A farm boy from Wisconsin. AP, 38 with a girl's name painted on its nose. A rivalry with Tommy McGuire that history resolved in the cruelest possible way. A marriage of 5 months. A child who would grow up without knowing his father. A fuel boost pump that failed on a clear morning in California. And a date, August 6, 1945, that belongs to two histories simultaneously. The history of the atomic bomb that ended the war, and the history of the greatest fighter pilot America ever produced, who died that morning in a field in Burbank before anyone knew the bomb had been dropped. The world moved on, as it always does. The war ended. The veterans came home. America entered the post-war boom and built its suburbs and its highways and its television culture. And the men who had fought in the Pacific grew older and quieter and eventually stopped talking about what they had seen and done because no one seemed quite ready to hear it. And Richard Bong lay in the ground in Poplar, Wisconsin, his story slowly receding from the front pages to the back pages to the history books to the footnotes too. For most people, nothing at all. But the record stands. It has stood for 80 years. It will stand for as long as people keep military records, which is to say for as long as there are people who understand what it means. 40 kills. No one has touched it. No one is going to touch it. The era that made it possible is gone, and the aviation world that exists today is not going to produce another Richard Bong, because it is not going to produce the specific combination of circumstances that allowed Richard Bong to become what he was. Which means that what we have is what we have. The number, the story, the beautiful and terrible irony of the ending, the farm boy and the jet and the California morning and the 9 days. We have this, and the question is what we do with it. For Marge Bong, who outlived her husband by decades, what she did with it was remember. She kept his letters. She kept the photographs. She raised their son and told him who his father was. She attended the ceremonies and accepted the honors on his behalf and never allowed anyone to forget that behind the ace and the record and the Medal of Honor and the 40 kills, there was a specific and particular young man who had been raised on a dairy farm in Wisconsin and who had loved flying with every part of himself and who had written her letters from the Pacific that she read and reread through all the long years of his absence and then all the longer years after he did not come back. That is how you honor someone like Richard Bong. Not with mythology, not with the simplified hero narrative that strips away the complexity and leaves only the legend, but with the full story. The farm, the flight lessons, the San Francisco stunt, New Guinea, the kills, the rivalry, the love story, the Medal of Honor, the test pilot assignment, the fuel boost pump, the field in Burbank, the 9 days, all of it, every part of it. Because that is who he was. Not a legend. Not a symbol. A person. The most extraordinary fighter pilot in the history of American aviation, yes. But also a son, a husband, a man who was going to be a father, a man who came from a place so small you have probably never heard of it, and did something so remarkable that no one has come close to matching it in 8 decades. A man who was taken from the world at 24 by a machine he was helping to make safe for the pilots who would come after him. And that, finally, is the answer to the question of why Richard Bong matters. Not just because of the 40 kills, not just because of the record, but because of the story of what it costs, what it really costs, to be the best that anyone has ever been at anything as dangerous and terrible and necessary as what he did. Because of the truth that his story tells about the distance between the glory of the achievement and the vulnerability of the human being who achieved it. Because of the reminder, sharp and permanent and impossible to argue with, that fate does not negotiate with greatness. He was the best, and it was not enough to save him. Remember the name. Major Richard Ira Bong. America's ace of aces. 40 kills. September 24th, 1920 to August 6th, 1945. 24 years old. Poplar, Wisconsin. The sky was his until it wasn't. Now, here is the question I want to leave you with today. Richard Bong survived 40 aerial combat victories against some of the most skilled enemy pilots in the world, only to be killed testing a peacetime aircraft 9 days before the war ended. Knowing everything you now know about his story, about who he was and what he accomplished and how he died, do you think the Army Air Forces made the right decision in assigning America's greatest ace to test the P-80 shooting star? Should they have protected him more aggressively, kept him away from anything risky until the war was fully over? Or was doing exactly the kind of dangerous, important, demanding flying that the test pilot role required the only life that would have made sense for a man like Richard Bong? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. If this story meant something to you, if it changed how you see the history of World War II and the men who fought it, do one thing. Share this video with someone who has never heard the name Richard Bong. Because the best way to honor a man that history has forgotten is to make sure history remembers him again.